So if you have your Bible, go ahead and open it up to Luke chapter 15. If you need a Bible, please slip up your hand. We'll put a Bible in your hand. We also have this note sheet. If you didn't get a note sheet on the way in, you can do that with a hand in the air. And we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. So if you didn't get one of these delightful little packets of juice and a mini wafer on the way in, you can get that with a hand in the air. And just as a reminder, we will be passing the plate after the sermon. And down at the bottom of this connection card, you can fill out your information if you're a visitor, as Joshua was talking about, or if you have prayer requests. We encourage you to fill that out, and then you just tear that off. And, I know passing the plate is one of those things that often can become, almost feels old-fashioned at times, and the way we pass the plate after the sermon during the worship, a lot of times, I'm in that moment of, praising God, and so I kind of am not even aware that there's a man with a little basket standing next to me. And so, and in addition, we give online, right? So the basket isn't even that super relevant to us, and so it's easy to overlook that, but actually it serves a pretty important function in the life of our congregation. So I would encourage you, when the ushers come down the aisles after the sermon or passing plates right after that first song, that you do just grab it and pass it to the person next to you, and kind of works its way through. So everybody has the opportunity to drop their connection card and potentially any kind of offering into that basket if possible. All right, Mr. TV, where are my slides? Is it coming? Seems like maybe. What's that? Is it my computer, you think? Maybe it's my little remote. Perfect. Let me just go kick my device over here. Get things rolling. Might be my slide machine. Here we go. Is something happening? No? All right, guys. Well, here's what we're going to do. We don't really need the slides this morning anyway. So, for whatever reason, my little advancer slide jangler is not advanced slide jangling. Well, what's this about? Yeah. Hey, there's some things that are happening. That's exciting. All right, well, at least we'll get that one up there. Perfect, nice, smooth start to the sermon. That's why you come here. High production value. It's like you're watching a TV show live. All right, so I wanted to make a quick comment about what we just heard. At Grace, we talk about our values, that we are, number one, rooted in the truth of Scripture. Number two, that we're committed to real relationships, authenticity with one another and with God. And then thirdly, that we're renegade in our commitment to follow Jesus wherever he leads. And that last word, renegade, it means that we've changed our ultimate allegiance, that we've renounced our allegiance to the world and committed ourselves to the kingdom of God. And I love what we just heard, but I also try to be careful not to overhype frontier workers, because not everyone is called to do what these guys have been doing. At the same time, I don't want to miss the opportunity to emphasize that being part of God's family means we are part of this renegade story of redemption that spans all of history and all the world. Not one of us here or anywhere is called to save the world. That's what God does. But every single one of us is called to live and speak and act in such a way that those around us have opportunity to meet the one who is saving the world, namely Jesus. That we are called to position our lives among the lost in such a way that we are obeying Jesus' great commission to go and make disciples of all nations. Now, this story, this lifestyle, comes when we meet Jesus and when we really experience his grace. When we embrace the kingdom, our story changes. The way we see the world changes. So I'll give you an example. I went back and forth about whether or not to use this, but I decided to, yes, use it. This week, a friend of mine sent me a picture he took on his phone of one of those yard signs, like, political campaign kind of sign things, and it was about a particular issue in Oconee County. They were concerned about rezoning a certain neighborhood to involve a bigger shopping center at the corner of the neighborhood. But do you know what the sign said? It said, "Don't Gwinnett our Oconee." Now that yard sign tells a story, doesn't it? It implies that something has gone wrong here in Gwinnett, I guess. A true confession, there have been a few days sitting in traffic on 124 when I would agree something has gone wrong here in Gwinnett. But think about that story. What does that yard sign imply has gone wrong here in Gwinnett? That there's too much commercialization, maybe. That there's too many people, perhaps. Maybe that's part of the story of that yard sign. Maybe there's too many people who don't look like me. What's gone wrong in Gwinnett for them to think they could put that story on a yard sign and motivate action? Like, for many faithful people here in this community, we have, over these last years, discerned and even talked about in this setting some troubling trends. We're praying for the school systems. We're praying for the political systems. We're praying for our police officers. But that slogan, "Don't Gwinnett our Oconee," tells a story that in many cases is powerful enough to literally move people. But what happens when a bigger story gets hold of your life? What happens when the gospel story gets hold of your life? Well, if you're like me, you look around this neighborhood and you think, this is a great place to live. Because if Jesus is calling us to make disciples of all nations, well, here we are. For years, Amy and I, we've wrestled back and forth. We've prayed about whether God is calling us to move overseas. I can't look at those slides of frontier peoples without my heart just getting tugged hard in that direction, I felt it a few weeks ago when we're hanging out with Muslims in the West Bank on the Epic trip. It's like, oh, Lord, are you calling me to move here? But one of the big things that God has done in our hearts is reminded and even comforted us with the reality that we live in Gwinnett, that the nations are here, people are here. I mean, what a deal we get living here in Gwinnett, because we have unreached neighbors and great carryout. I don't know if y'all have really great carryout, but we have great carryout here. Is it hard? Yeah. Does it create problems? Sure. Does sending our kids to public school mean that we have to have conversations that we didn't expect to until years down the road? Yep. But the more you live the gospel story, the more you realize that environments like these, diverse, challenging, these are our natural habitat. This is what we're called into. The big thing is how you live, where you live, and wherever you live, whether it's Oconee or South Asia, whether it's Gwinnett or Galilee in the first century. The key is to be confident that you're living and moving and serving from the right story, the true story, the gospel story. And this is exactly the problem the Pharisees had with Jesus in Luke chapter 15. The Pharisees were living out a story of performance and separation. That things would go well with the world if you just obey God, keep the rules, and avoid the wrong people. And then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up. And these Gospels here in the New Testament, they give us an account of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus is sharing meals with the wrong people in the perspective of the scribes and Pharisees. We see that in 15 verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' Jesus responds to their grumbling by telling them 3 stories, 3 parables, 3 brilliant, imaginative accounts that illuminate the great big story of restoration that was happening through Jesus. Now, last week, we saw the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Those parables highlight the depth of our lostness, the even deeper pursuit of God's love, like a shepherd going after that lost sheep, like a woman sweeping her house to search out the lost coin. But it also, those stories show us the deep joy of God in celebrating the restoration of what was lost. What we find, those 2 stories, those first 2 parables in Luke 15, were almost like appetizers for this 3rd parable. And so we're going to pick it up in verse 11. I want to invite you to stand as we've been doing. Now I'm going to read down through the end of the chapter, and then we will unpack it a little bit. What story are we living? Verse 11, and he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The word of the Lord. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about that question, what story are you living? Perhaps it's worth explaining that question a little bit more. What story are you living? See, when God created the world and then humans in the world, he invited us to be part of his story. That our identity would be found in the fact that we are loved and made in God's image. That our purpose would be coming from God's command to make the earth flourish, to be fruitful as we collaborate with him and with one another. That our destiny would be derived from God's desire that we know and love and glorify him. But then Adam and Eve and humans ever since decided to take history into our own hands. And so God's origin story splintered into 1,000 warped versions, trying to explain in all sorts of inadequate ways who we are, why we're here, what's the point. But just because all the stories got warped and shattered doesn't change our fundamental nature. God made us to be part of his story. And so human beings, all of us, each one, is living out some story. When someone asks you, who are you? You respond by telling a story. When we think about why we're here, we usually tell a story. Working a job to feed my family, that's a story. When we consider what's the point of all this, we usually look to a story. We think about people who embody the good life. We think about all these different things. So whether your goal in life is to live like LeBron James or to move to the other side of the world, all of those decisions are shaped out of a story. Stories have the power, quite literally, to move us. And the point is that as human beings, fundamentally, we are all living out some kind of story. When your teenager chooses to dress a certain way, listen to certain music, hang out with certain friends, talk in a certain way, they are living out a story about their own identity and destiny. When an immigrant to the United States moves back to his home country to take care of his aging mom and dad, he's living out a certain story that's been shaped by his experience, his culture, his tradition, his values. When an Islamic suicide bomber spends his life in a wanton act of violence, he's living a story. It is a warped story, but a story nonetheless. These stories, in some ways, at a level deeper than we even think about or are aware of, these stories shape our values, our doctrines, our decisions. They drive us. So back to this parable. What story was the younger son living? We use the word prodigal to describe this parable. This is the prodigal son. Now, word prodigal, it means wastefully extravagant. Verse 13, he squandered his property in reckless living. And the word there for property is the Greek word like ousia, substance. Literally, it's like the substance of his life he's pouring out in reckless living. And that word reckless living, it means something like the pursuit of life without any boundaries. I will do what I want. This gets us close to the story that the younger son in the parable is living. His request for his father's property, his inheritance before his father dies, is actually a rejection of his traditional responsibility as a son to honor his father. In this culture especially, children knew they had the responsibility to honor their father and mother. It doesn't just mean being nice or using respectful words. That means as your parents age, you keep them in your home, you support them. And so the request for his father's property is not only deeply offensive, it's also a rejection of any of those kind of traditional values that he would have grown up with. So the story that this son is living is that he's got to be true to himself. He's got to do what he believes will make him happy. Such an old story, so distant from our lives today, isn't it? Analysts looking at our culture today, they've used the phrase radical individual expressionism to describe the story that many live in our culture. That the greatest good is that I be free from all restraints, as long as I don't hurt anybody, to live whatever life I want to live, throwing off the traditional limitations and expectations. Of course, predictably, living this story does not go well for this son. His reckless commitment to self-actualization leads to this moment where he finds himself wanting to eat the pig slop. And he realizes, whoa, I love how Jesus tells the story. He came to himself. And in verse 18 and 19, he comes up with a plan. He's going to tell his dad he's sinned against heaven and earth, and then he's going to tell his dad, I'm no longer worthy to be your son, but treat me as a hired servant. So notice, at this point in the parable, he's going to go back, but his plan involves a lot of groveling, maybe even paying back his dad, working as a servant in the area. And so his story here has shifted from, I'll do whatever I want to be happy, from that to, I will accept less from life and do whatever I can in order to survive. Big change in story. He goes from, I'll do whatever I can to be happy, this is the story I'm living, to now, I will accept less from life and do whatever I can to survive. That other version, that second version of the story, well, that might also be familiar to some of you. But then when the son approaches his home, he finds that the father has been establishing a household on a different story altogether. Notice, the father's intent was never to control the younger son. I mean, that's seen plainly enough. When the son asks his dad for the inheritance, his dad gives it to him. He's willing to grant freedom to his younger son. The father's heart, the story of that household, was never one of domination or control, but rather, the father's heart was always for the son to find his home in the father's love. And so when he saw his boy from a long way off, he didn't feel scorn, he didn't feel anger, he didn't cross his arms and go, well, this is gonna be good. That kid has cost me so much. None of that. It says in verse 20, the father saw him and felt compassion. And then the father's compassion, in some ways, is more extravagant, more reckless than the son's life in the far country. The father runs to meet him. He says, get the robe, get the ring, get the shoes. What a welcome. And it's at this point when he's surprised to find himself in the father's embrace that the younger son finally begins to grasp this new story, that he is loved, and that his father truly desires the best for him. And so when he talks to his dad at this point, he starts that confession again. I know I've sinned against you and against heaven. But that idea of working it off, being penitential, that idea of being a hired hand and paying his dues is completely washed away in the flood of his father's love. And so Jesus here gives us a contrast between the story that the prodigal has been living and the story that the father lives. And it's a striking contrast. And you would think just that contrast alone would be enough for one parable. But wait, there's more. Jesus wants to make sure that we hear one more story from this family. Because we have to ask the question, what story is the older son living? Of course, when he comes back from working hard in the fields, because that's what older brothers do for the family, he hears the sound of the party beginning to swell. And in verse 29, he confronts his dad. His dad has to come out to him because he won't go into that party. An older son says, look, these many years I've served you and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never even gave me a young goat to throw a party with. And you can hear the story of the younger son. I've served you. I never disobeyed your command. You never even gave me a goat. Like, he is living a story of performance. Who am I? I'm the older son. I have responsibilities. What am I called to? Obedience. What's the point? Reward. This story that the older son is living causes him to resent his dad and really resent his little brother. I mean, just think about it. When the sounds of a good party make you mad, it means you're already pretty mad. You are walking around with a lot of anger and resentment. The sounds of the party, if they flip the switch and send you off the handle, you are already pretty mad. This son was already pretty mad. And he goes on, verse 30, talking about his little brother. He devoured your property with prostitutes. It's interesting because the prostitutes are brought up by the older brother. We don't know if that's actually what the younger brother did in the far country, but the older brother has had lots of time to imagine how his younger brother is squandering everything. Lots of time to marinate in his bitterness. So now, if we put this whole parable together, big picture. On the one hand, you've got the failed story of the prodigal living out his individual expressionism. On the other hand, you have the failed story of performance-based duty. And then right in the middle, you've got a father who wants to celebrate. So between the prodigal and the performance is the story of the true party. The father has given both sons freedom. But both sons, in their own ways, bought into stories that led to bondage. And so both sons are, in fact, lost. Even though one is closer to home and one is farther afield, both sons are lost. And the lostness is so deep that the father twice describes the return of his younger son as my son that was dead is now alive. Which, of course, brings us to the true heart of the story, to the heart of this gospel story that we're invited to live out. In the Father's household, who are you? Beloved, but lost. Why are you here? To be at home in the Father's love. What's the point? To join the great party of restoration. I mean, this story, and it's such a brilliant parable from Jesus that as a preacher, you hesitate to say too much. The parable itself, it stands on its own. It works its way in the side door of your imagination. It messes with you in the night. But this story reveals the grace of God on an unthinkable scale. I mean, this is a story that blows our human ideas of grace and reconciliation right out of the water. And yet we know it's not cheap grace. There are hints of what this story costs the father, not only in the initial division of his own property, but also in the killing of the fatted calf. But what is unmistakable is the joy of the shepherd who finds his sheep in the first parable, the joy of the woman who finds her coin in the second parable, the joy of the father who spies his son on the horizon and runs to meet him. That joy just ringing through. What's the story that God invites us to live? It's good news. It's a joyful story. It's impossibly costly grace given freely for the sake of an impossibly joyful restoration. The author James Smith talks about how in order to be restored, we must be restoried. In order to be restored, we must be restoried. What story are you living? Are you living a prodigal story? Running after whatever's individual expressionistic freedom thing, throwing off restraints? You running a prodigal story? Or are you running a performance story? I keep doing the right things, and so it's going to come around. Eventually, I'm going to get the life that I want. Get the Father to love me. Or are you living the party story? The gospel story. One way to know what story you're living is to just take stock of the way you see the world. Do you hang out with, do you dine with tax collectors and sinners? Or do you scorn those people? Don't Gwinnett Araconi. I mean, you don't have to move across the world to know this, but Jesus is inviting us to have the Father's heart. And if you do have the Father's heart, if your story that you're living is that gospel story, then you don't have to should yourself about mission and service, because you realize you were lost and now you're found, that you were dead, but now you're alive. And all you're really doing, whether it's in Gwinnett County or on the other side of the world, is wearing your new robe and your new shoes and inviting everyone to the story of the greatest party the world has ever known. What story are you living? One last word. Remember that in the context here of Luke 15, there is a debate from the religious crowd about Jesus' table habits with sinners and tax collectors. In the parable, the sinner, the younger son is the one who returns and experiences grace. But what about the older son? And part of the genius of this parable is that the destiny of the older son is left open. We don't know if that older son, the guy who's living out the performance story, will join the party. So piercingly, Jesus is telling the scribes and Pharisees who are listening to this parable, he's saying, you guys who think you have it all together, you're keeping all the rules, you're just as lost as the people you're calling sinners. And yet, in the good news story of God's restoration, Jesus leaves it open. You realize scribes, Pharisees, tax collectors, and sinners are all welcome at this party. The scribes and the Pharisees, the older brothers, they can join the party too. But the parable comes to a close, leaves us the question, will they? Will they join the party of God's grace? If you have your communion elements, I invite you to begin the arduous process of trying to wrest the bread out of this little sleeve and then prise off the foil to get to the cup. And I want you to think about the story that you're living. I want you to think about what these elements mean in your hands. Of course, this tradition in the church comes from the night before Jesus' crucifixion, when he sat with his disciples and he said, I'm going to give you this bread, and when you eat the bread, it's a reminder that it's my body that was broken for you. And then when you drink the cup, it's a reminder of my blood that is poured out for you and forms the new covenant of God's people. And so Jesus, when he gives this meal to his disciples, says very clearly that in receiving this meal, it's an act of receiving the grace of God, the forgiveness of sins that was released in Jesus' death and resurrection. In a way, when we eat this meal in faith, we are coming home again. We are remembering that as human beings, we have a tendency to live out all kinds of stories that are not God's story. And when we come to ourselves, again and again, we remember that forgiveness has already been given. Forgiveness doesn't even depend on our confession. God did this through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And so, eating this bread, drinking this cup, is first coming home, maybe like that younger son. We acknowledge, man, we have sinned against heaven and against our families. But we're not coming back downcast or resigned to some grim, penitent act as servants. What we remember is that when we come home, when we receive this grace that's already been given, we are invited into a joyous celebration. Is there grief on the part of God over the ways that we have gone astray? Yes. Was there grief in the younger son when he found himself face down with pigs? Yes. But in the discovery of grace, all that is washed away in God's joy and the invitation to the great party of restoration. So if we are to be restored, we must be restored. Is this your story? Are you trying to perform? Are you still trying to go do whatever you want? Or do you recognize there's a Father who wants nothing but the best for you, is willing to sacrifice everything that you would be at home in the house of his love? That's what we hold in our hands. And that's what we're unleashed into the world to live out, a different story, whether it's here or on the other side of the globe, inviting all those around, dining with tax collectors and sinners, so that they know the offer of God's love is not exclusive. That offer is open to anybody who will turn to him. And so, God, we thank you for these components, this bread and this cup. And Lord, right now, we invite your Holy Spirit to do that work of just helping us sort out the kind of story we've been living, where our deepest allegiance has tended. And Lord, we ask that even as we come to this meal once again, it would be an expression of our trust that you have love and grace for us. And that because of what you've done on the cross, our sin has been reckoned with. Because of what you've done on the cross, evil has been overcome. Because of what you did at the resurrection, death is no more. And so that in eating this meal, we join in your story, your great story of restoration. So together, as a body, we eat this bread, and we drink this cup. And we thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name.
Thanks for watching this Grace Snellville video. We want to help you get connected to everything happening around the Grace Snellville community. We want to pray with you, and we want to help equip you to follow Jesus well. Would you just take a moment, even now, to go to our website at gracesnellville.com. We hope to see you soon.